Hello, everyone, and what's doing? Today, we're going to speak with journalist Colin Miner. Colin has written for the New York Times and the Washington Post, as well as many other prominent news organizations. Colin knew my father, and they liked each other. Not an easy thing for writers. Colin has written extensively about Jimmy's writings, and we're going to have a conversation about Jimmy's columns that centered on the assassination of John F. Kennedy. President Kennedy has been shot, stat, the operator said, Colin Miner wrote. At 1:34 that afternoon, things changed for Breslin, for the paper, for the country. As reporters and editors milled about the dusty fifth-floor newsroom of the Herald Tribune's office on West 41st Street, the United Press International teletype sent an electric jolt. UPI 7NDA. Proceed Kennedy, Dallas, November 22nd. 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade today in downtown Dallas. We're here speaking with Colin Miner, formerly of The Patch, New York Times, the Oregonian, the New York Post, the New York Sun, and he's writing a book. Obviously a very talented man. Colin, we want to go back with how you discovered Jimmy Breslin and how he handled death in emergency room number 1. And I'll tell you why. Because I always wondered, how did my father quickly get to Dallas? We didn't have any money. He had to take an airplane. Wow. My mother wasn't driving him like we'd always jump in the car. And so started his life in a very big way, how he went to the, if you will, the loser's locker room. What do you think, Colin?
Well, for the first part of your question, how I discovered your father was, it was a pretty good story. I mean, like everybody in the world, I just grew up reading him and, just marveled at how he did stuff. And, it was always there was a fight within me. Do you try to copy him? Do you try to learn what he did? And it was never an easy thing because he was such a giant figure who had clearly done everything, knew everybody, and been anywhere. So then one day I'm writing for a weekly paper in Manhattan covering politics, and I did a story about your stepmother. And, she was getting ready to run for council, I believe was the reason. So then a couple days later, the paper comes out and the phone in the newsroom rings, and I pick up the phone and it's your dad. And all he says is, "It's Breslin. Meet me for coffee at this time at this place," and hangs up. So I'm terrified because here is this legend. The conversation is him barking directions at me. And I immediately go back. I'm trying to reread the story, figuring out what could I have done that would get him angry. And so I'm terrified. I meet him for coffee, and he's like, "I like what you did." And from then on, I was one of the countless reporters over the years that he mentored, he counseled, took ideas from, and so on.
But more importantly, you zeroed right in on how he went to work because he called himself a deadline player.
Right.
I really want to specifically discuss that, how you detailed, like he detailed Death in Emergency 1.
So, all right, so I had read the story like so many people, and he never really liked talking about the story. He did it. He felt the story stood on its own. And I remember once I asked him, how did you go about it? And he said, read the story. And over the years, I got him to break down a little bit about, certain elements of it. And by that point, I'd also become friends with some of the other players in the story, Dick Wald. I spoke to Bellows a few times. And I started to realize that the story of how he put that together was the story of how you do journalism. If you take the time and read A Death in Emergency Room 1, you will realize that the world of journalism opens up, a potential opens up before you. It is a monument to everything that reporters can do right. It brings you into the emergency room. It brings you to the surgeon having lunch when he got the call. It brings you right into every single situation. Um,
Yes, you said that Breslin was at the Herald Tribune just hours after Kennedy had been assassinated. It was not his plan to write two pieces, but they'd be taught in journalism schools for the next 60 years. But more importantly, what you said was, and you followed Breslin when he found Dr. Perry and he started to write, and you wrote it too in your column, observing how Breslin worked. This is Dr. Perry taking Dr. Shire's place, he said. You said Breslin went out and talked to everyone and found all this information. They said over the intercom, President Kennedy had been shot. Stat, the operator said. They are bringing him into the emergency room right now. The call bothered Dr. Perry. Dr. Tom Shires, stat, the girl's voice said over the loudspeaker in the doctor's cafeteria at Parkland Memorial Hospital. The stat meant emergency. Nobody ever called Tom Shires, the hospital chief resident in surgery, for an emergency. And Shires, Perry's superior, was out of town for the day. Dr. Malcolm Perry looked at the salmon croquettes on his plate in front of him. Then he put down his fork and he went over to the telephone. I mean, Colin, you described this piece and brought us right into it, describing how my father did this. And you saw this piece, you felt it.
I think that understanding that piece and show, one of the things your dad always said was, use your feet, get out, talk to people. You're never going to find the story sitting in the office. And he, on that piece, he was at the press conference and there were a million people there. And he knew that that was not what he wanted to do, and so he left the first press conference he went to, and he started to go out to the various scenes, try to find the people, be able to witness with his eyes, get to see what people saw. He didn't want to just depend on, second, third hand recollections. He wanted to be able to, be along the route where Kennedy had been shot. He wanted to know, what people, he wanted to get a sense of what people saw, what the street looked like. There was no detail that was too small for him. Now, clearly, not every detail made it into the story, but he wanted to make sure that he didn't leave a stone unturned. He didn't want to miss anything. He wanted to see it. He wanted to be able to tell the readers about it. And he wanted the readers to be able to feel like they were there.
That's exactly right, because you said, describing him, that he liked to talk about the importance of using a single person to tell a larger story.
Right.
He described the doctor when he walked into the emergency room. He walked past the girl in pink and took on the hopeless job of trying to save the president of the United States. He said, Dr. Perry walked into it. The room is narrow and has gray tiled walls and a cream colored ceiling. In the middle of it, on an aluminum hospital cart, the president of the United States had been placed on his back and he was dying while a huge lamp glared in his face.
He went in, your dad went into, at one point, he went into the emergency room. He wanted to be able to see what everybody saw. He wanted to know what the colors of the wall were. He wanted to know the ceiling. He wanted to know, the giant operating room lamp. he wanted to know that it was there, what it looked like.
He removed emotion, Colin, because he
Right.
used to tell me that remove emotion. He'd go in there really cold. I used to observe that. There was like a side, almost like a great shark making a move on somebody. Because he said, you get a little picture that reflects the whole. Then you get the reader interested in the life of one guy, and he can reflect the whole life around him. And I
Right.
think that's what he did with Dr. Perry, because he described how the man, after he finished his salmon, hung up the phone and walked quickly out of the cafeteria and down a flight of stairs and pushed through a brown door. And the nurse pointed to the emergency room number 1. And Dr. Perry walked into it. So he broke down the beats. I mean, when I read it, I said, was he in that room? I hadn't read anybody this acutely specific. And when you rehashed everything and broke it down, your writing was so superb that you understood it at a higher level than most people. And that's not being effusive. You grabbed onto it.
Well, I thought, his whole, your dad was very conscientious to make sure he walked through the brown door. He walked into emergency room 1. He wanted to make sure he saw what Perry saw. He wanted to be able to tell his readers, this is what it looked like as Perry walked in.
Exactly. And then he said John Kennedy had already been stripped of his jacket, shirt, and T-shirt. And a staff doctor was starting to place an endotracheal tube down the throat. Oxygen would be forced down the tube. Breathing was the first thing to attack. The president was not breathing. I read this and I said, how did he get this?
It's because your dad talked with everybody. He really, to him, and this is something that he carried through his entire career. A lot of people since then have tried to imitate his style, but without doing the work. And it shows.
Impossible. Impossible. So back to his precise detail, Breslin wrote, he noticed the tall, dark-haired girl in the pink suit that had her husband's blood all over the front of the shirt. She was standing out of the way, over against the gray tile wall. Her face was tearless as it was set, and it was to stay that way because Jacqueline Kennedy, with a terrible discipline, was not going to take her eyes from her husband's face. And when I read that, I said, how did he get even that?
No, I mean, and I think that's one of the reasons that people called what your dad was doing new was because people were used to reading novels. People were used to reading short stories. They were not used to reading that style of writing in a newspaper piece.
Live? It was live.
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, he knew that such a monumental event, such a huge piece of history with so many moving parts, the only way to really understand it as something that was happening was to take people step by step through what happened. One of the great things that your dad taught me is when you want to talk with someone, you ask if you can talk with them, not talk to them. Because when you talk with someone, you're being inclusive. When you talk to someone, you're being aggressive. And he understood the importance of talking with people, of making people feel comfortable. He didn't, if it was a politician, he had no problem telling them to go to hell or whatever.
That's too
But,
kind. You're
right.
too kind.
But if it was a question of, talking to someone who's been through a trauma, someone who, has witnessed something horrible, he wanted to make sure they understood he was there to tell their story. He wasn't looking to impose his view. He wanted to let people tell their own story.
Exactly, because he said the chest was not moving and there was no apparent heartbeat inside it. The wound in the throat was small and neat. Blood was running out of it. It was running out too fast. The occipitopatial, excuse me if I butchered that, which is part of the back of the head, had a huge flap. The damage a rifle bullet does as it comes out of a person's body is unbelievable. Bleeding from the head wound covered the floor. There was a medicinal wound in connection with the bullet hole in the throat. This means air and blood were being packed together in the chest. Perry called for a scalpel. He was going to start a tracheotomy, which is opening the throat and inserting a tube into the windpipe. The incision had to be made below the small bullet wound.
Well, the amazing thing about that is after your dad's piece appeared, Perry was asked by people about it. And he was very upfront. He's like, Jimmy got some of the details about the names of the procedures wrong.
I couldn't even pronounce it.
Right. But that the truth of it was 100% on. You know, if he butchered a procedure's name, he butchered the name. But the fact is, all the details about how people were feeling, what things looked like, and the general, he said, your dad got it all right.
Yeah, I think he said something that Esposito in that new book they wrote about him. I don't care about the facts. I tell the truth.
Jimmy always cared about the truth. Always cared about the facts.
Yes.
He tried, if he got something wrong, he got something wrong, but it wasn't because he didn't care. He wanted to know everything. He was so intent on knowing everything that after he filed the column, he wanted to go back and keep reporting it. And Dick Walt said to him, you can't do it. You got to get to DC. And, they basically had to force him out of Dallas.
We'll get there. But you're right about he wanted to go back for the details, because then he wrote, while Perry worked on the throat, he said quietly, will somebody put a right chest tube in, please? The tube was to be inserted so it could suction out the blood and air packed in the chest and prevent the lung from collapsing. A transfusion was to begin with O negative type blood.
There was nothing he didn't want to know.
You understand this? And then he picked up by saying, these things he was doing took only small minutes, and other doctors and nurses were in the room and talking and moving, but Perry does not remember them. He saw only the throat and chest shining under the huge lamp, and when he would look up or move his eyes between motions, he would see this pink suit and the terribly disciplined face standing over against the gray tile wall. Just as he finished the tracheotomy, Dr. Perry looked up, and Dr. Kemp Clark, the chief neurosurgeon in residency at Parkland, came in through the door. Clark was looking at the President of the United States. Then he looked at Malcolm Perry, and the look told Malcolm Perry something he already knew. There was no way to save the patient. I mean, he brought it to so precise. Even we get quiet as we're listening to talking with one another here. And then he said, would you like to leave, ma'am? Kemp Clark said to Jacqueline Kennedy, we can make you more comfortable outside. Just the lips moved. No, Jacqueline Kennedy said. He went right into like Jackie O with this whole thing. Like he brought her into the scene, standing there with the pink jacket and the blood. He said, now Malcolm Perry's long fingers ran over the chest under him, and he tried to get a heartbeat. And even the suggestion of breathing, and there was nothing. There was only the still body, pale white in the light, and it kept bleeding. And now Malcolm Perry started to call for things and move his hands quickly because it was all running out. I mean, this is so live, Colin.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, you know, when your dad talked about how everything up to that point had been training for that point, was he knew he didn't sit there and say, okay, here's the story I'm going to cover. What steps do I need to take? He knew instinctually I got to, he had to be a vacuum cleaner. He needed to get everything. He needed every single piece of, dirt, everything he could get, he needed to make this piece work. He needed all the details. He
He
didn't,
used those eyes and ears, Colin. He
right,
didn't talk. Economy of movement, he used to tell me.
right,
Economy of movement. I'd be with him in places. You don't move. You just listen. You don't write too much with the reporter pad. You just listen and you don't talk. He
right,
was adamant about that. You do not talk.
right.
I mean, because he must have dug deep when he went back to this doctor, and then he said, the doctor must have told him everything, because he said he began to massage the chest. He had to do something to stimulate the heart. There was no time to open the chest and take the heart in his hands. So he had to massage on the surface. The aluminum cart was high. It was too high. Malcolm Perry was up on his toes so he could have leverage. Will somebody please get me a stool, he said. One was placed under him. He sat on it for 10 minutes and he massaged the chest. Over in the corner of the room, Dr. Kemp Clark kept watching an electronic cardiogram for some sign that the massaging was creating action in the president's heart. There was none. Dr. Clark sadly turned his head away from the electrocardiogram. It's too late, Mac, he said to Malcolm Perry. I mean,
Again, your dad knew the best way to tell the story was beat by beat, keep it simple, just lay out the facts. People will feel the emotion.
exactly, because when he wrote the line, it's too late, Mac, he said to Malcolm Perry. The long fingers stopped massaging and they were lifted from the white chest. Perry got off the stool and stepped back. Dr. M.T. Jenkins, who had been working with the oxygen flow, reached down from the head of the aluminum cart. He took the edges of a white sheet in his hands. He pulled the sheet up over the face of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The IBM clock on the wall of the room said it was 1 p.m. The date was November 22nd, 1963. Details.
Yeah. Yeah. And, he was able to write that it was an IBM clock because he went in the room and he saw. He didn't, someone like Perry or Clark, they probably knew there was a clock. I'm sure they didn't know it was an IBM clock. That's because your dad, he went through the brown doors, made the left into the emergency room, and
The
looked
white
around.
sheet, the white sheet going up over his face.
Right.
He said 3 policemen were moving down the hall outside the emergency room number 1 now, and they were calling to everybody to get out of the way. But this was not needed because everybody stepped out of the way automatically when they saw the priest who was behind the police.
This episode of Breslin's What's Doing is brought to you by EV Safety. EV Safety. Reduce your liability, protect your customers and property. Keep insurance premiums down. Let EV Safety develop your facility's lithium-ion risk management plan with training, certification, and equipment. More U.S. cities are passing safety ordinances requiring on-site countermeasures to fight lithium-ion battery fires. EV fires are inevitable, as is your liability if you operate EV charging stations or park EVs on your property. When you have an EV battery fire on your property, a few minutes can make the difference between cosmetic and catastrophic damage. No company can afford a hazmat vent on their property. Contact us today for your evaluation on all your training and certification at evsafetyproducts.com. Once again, evsafetyproducts.com. Medford Fast Lube. Put your car in good hands. With more than 25 years of experience, the experts at Medford Fast Lube will care for your vehicle like it's our own without breaking the bank. Take the stress out of the unexpected. If your car needs repair, it can be expensive as well as stressful. Take some of that weight off your shoulders with free estimates from the experts at Medford Fast Loop. Our friendly staff is here to help. Located at Route 112 in Medford, New York. www.medfordfastloop.com or dial 631-475-2107. Medford Fast Loop. Advisor Insurance Group. Advisor Insurance resource experts in life, disability, long-term care, business, home, and auto insurance across the U.S. With over 60 insurance companies offered and over 30 years of combined experience, Advisor Insurance Resource simply can't be beat. Call 866-942-4181 or on the web at advisorinsurancresource.com.
He knew that he needed to talk to Father Oscar Huber. He knew that that was going to be an important part of the story, and he knew that the best way that, he didn't want to take a chance he was not going to be able to get to him. So he called your mom and said, I need you to go to the church and find someone who can make a call for him, because he wanted to make sure he had all his bases covered, that there was no way he didn't talk to Huber.
I know. It was amazing. And he said, when he saw the priest, and I was wondering even how he found this out. And you were so good that you found out about my mother, because I always wondered about that. And then JB wrote, here was the Reverend Oscar Huber, a small 70-year-old man. He was walking quickly. Malcolm Perry turned to leave the room as Father Huber came in. Perry remembers seeing the priest go by him, and he remembers his eyes seeing that pink suit and that terribly disciplined face for the last time as he walked out of emergency room number 1, and he slumped into a chair out in the hall. I mean, he's crossing paths in the lives of the people. It's like he had in our world now, we'd have a video camera doing this.
Yeah, I mean, that's it's funny. I sometimes try to imagine how that would be covered today, and there would be no place, I think, no opportunity to do it that way, because things move so quickly now that the concept of, it's like if you can't report it in 20 seconds, it's not worth pursuing. And the thing about this piece is, your dad took a whole 24 hours to put this piece together. And, they don't do that anymore.
And they're doing a tremendous disservice, not sticking up for journalists. They're doing a tremendous disservice for intellect.
Right.
Because if you took a few minutes and you read something like this, you really may grasp something and remember it. And
Right.
It hit you in the heart. If the video world of capturing it so fast, you missed everything. You missed the tiny details. And here he picked up on, Breslin said, everything that was inside that room now belonged to Jacqueline Kennedy and Father Oscar Huber and the things which they believed. He said to Jacqueline, I'm sorry, you have my deepest sympathies, Father Huber said. Thank you, Jacqueline Kennedy said. How the hell did he find this stuff out?
From Huber, and I think there was still, even though it was, I think there were other people in the room. I think there was still a nurse in the room at the time.
They must have been, because he said Huber pulled the white sheet down so he could anoint the forehead of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Jacqueline Kennedy was standing beside the priest, her head bowed, her hands clasped across the front of the pink suit that was stained with blood, which came from her husband's head. Now this old priest held up his right hand, and he began to chant that Roman Catholic priests have said over their dead for centuries. Si vivis, eco tu absolvo, e peccatis tuis. In nomine Patri, e Filii, e Spiritus Sancti. Amen. I mean, it's the prayer that if you are living, I absolve you from your sins. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. Amen. The priest reached into his pocket and took out a small vial of holy oil. He put the oil on his right thumb and made a cross on the president's forehead. Then he blessed the body again and started to pray quietly. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, Father Huber said. And let perpetual light shine upon him, Jacqueline Kennedy answered. She did not cry. Father Huber prayed like this for 15 minutes, and for 15 minutes, Jacqueline Kennedy kept praying aloud with him. Her voice did not waver. She did not cry. From the moment the bullets hit her husband and he went down onto his face in the back of the car on the street in Dallas, there was something about this woman that everybody who saw her keeps talking about. She was in shock, but somewhere down under that shock, someplace, she seemed to know that there is a way to act when the president of the United States had been assassinated. She was going to act that way, and that the fact that the president was her husband only seemed to make it more important that she stand and look at him and not cry.
I mean, there's so many things that are great about this piece. And the fact is each section, each scene is almost a master class in how to report a story. Even if it's a few paragraphs, he lays it out. He's like, here are the elements you need to tell a powerful story. Don't embellish. There's no need to embellish. If the story is powerful, if it's worth telling, then tell it straight. Don't lay on a bunch of bullshit. People will see it as bullshit. And
Yes, it will. Yes,
and
it
he
will.
was careful about that. He
To the best of my knowledge, he always was. To the
Right.
best of my knowledge. Very little embellishment with anything serious. None.
Right.
This is not humor now we're talking about here.
Right.
And he said, when he finished praying, Father Huber turned and took her hand. I am shocked, he said. Thank you for taking care of the president, Jacqueline Kennedy said. I am convinced that his soul had not left his body, Father Huber said. This was a valid last sacrament. Thank you, she said. I mean, he went into the details of the priest, how he found him. My mother helped find him. The priest then told my father everything. He said he had been eating lunch in the rectory at Holy Trinity Church when he heard the news. He and his assistant drive him to the hospital immediately. And after that, everything happened quickly, and he did not feel anything until later. Now he's capturing the priest who was the last man there.
Right.
I mean, he sat with him in the rectory, and the priest said, I've been a priest for 32 years. This was the first, and he started talking about his own life. He said, the first time I was present at a death a long time ago, back in my home in Perryville, Missouri, I attended a lady who was dying of pneumonia. She was in her own bed. But somehow, I remember that. But this is different, he said. It isn't the blood, you see. I've anointed so many accident victims. I anointed once a boy who was only in pieces. No, it wasn't the blood. It was the enormity of it. I'm just starting to realize it now.
It goes back to, the fact that, your dad wanted people to feel comfortable. He wanted, even
It's not
though,
easy getting a priest to talk about last rites and stuff here.
right.
It's a sensitive area.
Right. No, he was, one of the things that made your dad such a huge success, even though he wouldn't necessarily think about it in these terms, is your dad was one of the most empathetic people around. He could be in a room with you and make sure that you felt like you were the most important person in the world at that time. He was a big character unto himself, but when he was interviewing someone, he was just there to help them.
Now we're talking business. You're absolutely right.
It's impossible to read that piece and not sit back and go, I can't believe it. And because it not only does it take you there, it opens up a world for other reporters to say, you know, I may not be able to do this, but I can do my best. And I can learn from how he did this
Because
and do
Breslin,
my best.
you're right. I agree not to cut you off there, but I wanted to give you one more thought. Breslin grabbed Perry and asked more about things Perry felt was seemingly irrelevant. He wanted to know about Perry's impression of the president, what it had been like to go home that night, to be back with his family. It all left the surgeon somewhat befuddled.
The average person would see these questions as maybe irrelevant. But to Jimmy, it was essential to find out everything he could about that period of time in Perry's life. He wanted to be able to know, he wanted to be able to write the piece as if he was Perry. He wanted people to, he didn't want people to think about Jimmy Breslin. He wanted people to think about Father Oscar Huber. He wanted people to think about Dr. Malcolm Perry. He didn't want them to think about him. If JB can sit there and get the doctor talk about the president dying in his presence, then you should be able to talk to a a woman whose apartment was just destroyed by fire. It's he did it. You should be able to do what you need to do.
And then he went to the funeral director. He wrote, while waiting for the press conference, Breslin tracked down the funeral director, who told Breslin he was making sure that the president would be carried back to Washington, D.C. in the best possible bronze casket.
Right.
I mean, we relived here the whole shooting, life-saving attempt, anointment, death, the doctor talking about his feelings, and even what kind of casket, a bronze casket. I mean, did anybody else have this kind of detail? Breslin wrote, but he did not get them. So when a little bit after 1 o'clock on that bitter Friday afternoon, bitter, he even knew how cold it was, the phone rang in the O'Neill funeral home, 3206 Oak Lawn. Vernon B. O'Neill answered. The voice on the other end of the phone spoke quickly. This is the Secret Service calling from Parkland Hospital, it said. Please select the best casket in your house and put it in a general coach and arrange for a police escort and bring it here to the hospital as quickly as you humanly can. It is for the President of the United States. The voice went off the phone. O'Neill called for Ray Gleason, his bookkeeper, and a workman to help him take a solid bronze casket out of the place and load it onto a hearse. It was for President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Breslin never stopped digging.
No, no. And if Walt hadn't made him get on a plane for DC, he'd probably still be there.
Yeah. He just kept digging and digging and digging. And Breslin wrote, O'Neill left his shop early. He said he was too tired to work. Dr. Malcolm Perry was at the hospital. He had on a blue dark striped tie, and he sat in a big conference room and looked out the window. He is tall, reddish-haired, 34 years old, who understands that everything he saw or heard is part of history, and he is trying to get down for the record everything he knows about the death of the 35th president of the United States. And Perry had some line. I never saw a president before, Dr. Perry said. I mean, he mixed all these details into a 2,500 word masterpiece, A Death in Emergency Room 1.
Right. One of the amazing things about the piece is it's 2,500 words, which is long for a newspaper piece, but at the same time, you feel there's so much there that it's almost like he wrote a whole novel in those 2,500 words.
Mhm.
There's scenes, there are characters, there's an arc. He takes the reader, he puts them right where it happened. It's they are suddenly they've read 2,500 words, but they might as well have read 2,500 pages. They might have seen a movie for 2,500 hours. They were given an experience that they were not going to get anywhere.
Because you said that Breslin was right, Perry said it, with the focus of the piece, the major elements right.
Right.
I mean, it's not easy to do.
No.
It sounds easy us talking about it, but I sure as hell wouldn't want to sit there with blank paper and try this.
Anyone who reads the piece or was involved in the piece have all said, he got it right. He preserved the piece of history.
Yep. All right. Well, I think we discussed a very significant column that helped his career significantly. And then we're going to discuss as we move ahead into his next piece. And we'd like to connect also John Jones, who happens to be Clifton Pollard's son, because we're going to talk how my father was then told by Bellows and Wald he's got to get out of Dallas and stop worrying about this and get to Washington, D.C., where they're going to bury John Fitzgerald Kennedy.